Let me give you a brief introduction on our speaker today. Susan Krauss Whitbourne is one of the pioneers in the field of adult development and aging. And prior to joining us here at UMass Boston, and I hope you've seen her around last semester and this semester, she coordinated the Aging and Development Lab at UMass Amherst, where students, her undergraduate students, right? Her undergraduate students and grad conducted research on personality, aging, and cognition. She holds emeritus status from UMass Amherst, and Professor Whitbourne has authored numerous books and articles and posts regularly on her Fulfillment and NEH blog for Psychology Today. So we heard more about that during lunch today, and it really sounds, talk about accessible, popular psychology, this is the place to go. And what I didn't realize, and faculty members, you might be interested, she actually gets royalties by hit. She has appeared in numerous media outlets, including Dateline NBC, the New York Times, Newsweek, the Boston Globe, Red Bull, More Magazine, and Susan, Glamour and Cosmopolitan?
Absolutely.
Okay. Natural Health and the Chicago Tribune. Her work has been on the topic of her work has been a topic of interviews on the Discovery Health Channel and the online guide to the PBS series Discovering Psychology. She is also a particular favorite among the Canadian media, discussing the psychology of hockey fans, and has been quoted numerous times in the Toronto Star, the Sun newspaper chain, and has appeared on Canada TV's national morning show, Canada AM, Canada Morning. And I understand that she's a regular on a radio station there too, and that they really look to her in terms of the psychology of fans. A fellow of the American Psychological Association, the Association for Psychological Science, and the Gerontological Society of America, she served in a variety of leadership roles for each of these organizations. In 2011, she received a presidential citation from the American Psychological Association for her leadership and dedication to the profession. And an example of recent research, which I continue to be amazed at this too, is her investigation of the relationship between video gaming and cognition in older adults. So, really interesting person, and we're thrilled to have her here. Susan,
thank you.
All yours.
Thank you, Nina, for that kind introduction. And I know some of the things I do, I just wonder, and yet it doesn't all relate to this, but I'm not sure if this is a good model or not for students because, we like to think that we're very focused and within our professional kind of trajectory, and mine's been a little bit bouncing around, but it all relates to somehow personality and identity and the things that really interest me, and of course aging, which has been my interest since my entire career, even prior to college. It's been a wonderful ride, and I've enjoyed it, and I'm really happy the ride has brought me east from Amherst to Boston, and I'm really thrilled to be here with colleagues I've known for many, many years, just passing through and at the GSA meeting, and now get to see you guys on a regular basis. So the study I'm going to talk about today does concern this research project that has kind of defined the core of my interests throughout my career. I'll tell you some of the highways and byways about this project when we get into the details, just so I think it'll be interesting for students to hear some of the ways that research happens that isn't always predictable. I'm going to start with just talking about personality for people who aren't on top of all the sort of psychology, trait theory, etc. Just going through what psychologists mean when they talk about personality, and then what we have focused on in the study. So the three basic models is the one that probably many people are familiar with. Trait theory. It's the theory, it's your go-to theory anytime you're talking about somebody, you're trying to describe them. Well, the person is nice, and they're warm, and they're gregarious, or they're not, and they're cold and aloof and domineering. So all these terms that we use for people fit in with traits. And the trait theory that's been the most popular is called the five-factor theory, also referred to as ocean and canoe. Because you can abbreviate the initials: openness, conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, and extroversion. So that's been looked at a lot in psychology. And the old view of traits was that they don't change at all. And then they started revamping their models to say, well, change is possible. But it's not exactly the most, it doesn't lend itself to be a theory of change. So crisis theories of adulthood do talk about these predictable passages, these age-defined periods from 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, different transitions. And these theories do tend to focus on midlife crisis, which actually half of my appearances on TV and stuff have been due to hockey, and the other half due to midlife crisis. And people just not accepting that there's no such thing as a midlife crisis. And I keep saying, it's a myth, people. And we have data, and I have data. I mean, everybody's got data showing it's a myth. And they just keep beating this, into the ground. And I'll say to somebody interviewing me, well, but there really are no data to support midlife crisis. Well, what about a quarter life crisis? No, you're not getting this, okay? Age is not going to be a determining factor in personality. Sorry, it'd be nice if it was. It would be convenient. It would save a lot of effort on the part of those of us trying to understand personality. Just say, oh, well, based on your age, you're this, this, and this. But we don't have a Dr. Spock for adulthood. And so that theory, but it just keeps hanging around. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't have periods of evaluation and change, but they're not defined by age. And part of what this study has done that I've been involved with, that I'm not really going to talk about here, was to look at qualitative change models and to look at people in the sample and see who showed which sort of predominant pattern. And there were people who were just straight and narrow, other people who were constantly in crisis, and then people who would kind of go back, veer around a little bit until they found the most compatible paths for themselves. So it's not like this is complete trash and should be thrown out. It's just calling something a crisis associated with age is it's a fallacy. And then psychosocial development, which I always found the most interesting and which this study evolves out of, is the theory of Erikson that we go through not crisis stages, although they're sometimes labeled that. But Erikson was a psychoanalyst by training. He was very straight and narrow psychoanalyst, and then he became more oriented towards social and emotional development and the effects of history and context on development. So the theory definitely moved beyond straight Freudian. And the way I like to describe the theory is by using a complete matrix that shows there are these issues that we are all confronting. Now, he called them ego development. So the ego, again, he starts out as a Freudian. Ego is sort of the self. It's the more cognitive aspect of people's psyche, as it were. And according to Erikson, the ego, if you live long enough, you're going to go through these periods where you're maximally vulnerable to certain concerns. And they're unfortunately labeled crises. I call them issues. And the ages that he associates with these are approximate. But the reason I like to show this in a matrix is you'll often see it as a ladder or series of steps, which I don't agree with because it locks it too much into age and stage. What Erikson said was, because you're, say, in this age, adolescence, you're college students, you're trying to arrive at an identity. You're trying to figure out where you want to, what you want to do with your life, your occupational commitments, your values, religion and politics, gender. All of these get thrown into the mix, partly because society is saying, make up your mind and where you're going to go to college and what are you going to do with your life, etc. And partly because people's the brains are developing and you're able to conceptualize at a more abstract level. You're able to think about the future more realistically, or at least project into the future. So you have that. You have emotional development, like gaining of emotional control over those wonderful years. Anybody who's raising or raised teenagers, we all know what the emotional vacillations can be like. But all of this is happening in your maximal vulnerability for identity issues. So then when you kind of resolve those, you would be ready to move on, but society's going to kick you along anyway and get you into that next issue, because then the next thing you'll ask is, about your relationships, or when are you going to settle down, and all that familiar horrible things that people say to you get said a lot, and now you're kicked into that stage, but you might not be completely ready for it. But Erickson's theory says, as you go through life, this is a point of maximum vulnerability when you will be most likely to be confronting this specific issue. But it doesn't get completely solved then, because later on in life, you can again face issues of identity. When people retire, that's a prime time for thinking about identity and work identity. And so you can definitely be thinking about it later, so you could be here in that part of the matrix. And then, it's hard to imagine a little tiny baby dealing with, identity issues of that nature. So it's a little bit of a stretch, but still there is a sense of self that starts to emerge early in infancy. It gets tested out more, these stages, the toddlerhood, and here's where trust, the foundation of personality, is established, feeling that the environment will care for you, look after you. So all of these are issues that people face, again, along the matrix, but they can face at the off-diagonal point. So if you're 65 and older, you could be involved in a new relationship. You could also be dealing with issues of trust if you're feeling particularly brutalized by ageism and people, being mean to you, and also, being a victim of crime, poor housing, poverty, etc. So that can re-escalate those issues again. But these are the points of maximum vulnerability and the most likely periods when these changes occur. Now, one of the fundamental aspects of Erickson's theory is the idea that early success breeds later success, which is always true, even in hockey. But here it's a little more reliable in that if you build a stable foundation of personality early on, it's going to help you later in life when things don't go so well, and vice versa. People with trust problems in infancy, and now we call it attachment issues, have a great deal of difficulty in their current, not only romantic relationships, but even their own sense of self becomes distorted. So a good foundation, and I definitely have found this in my own research, is that the people who withstood the travails of their later life periods had a better foundation and trust early on, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So the point of my research was to try to figure out, if there was any empirical basis in Erickson's theory. It's a lovely theory, 8 ages man in this book, beautiful, he's a very good writer, it's very romantic, but there's no data to support it in Erickson's writing. It emerged out of a theory, a series of lectures he gave actually at Harvard when he first got to this country. So it was, his clinical experience, it was watching children play, sort of influenced him, reading historical biographies influenced him. But then, those people who liked the theory started to try to figure out what the basis for it was, including me. So I started my first job, this is where the guests seem to be interested. I was, actually my second job, I was at the University of Rochester. I had just gotten hired, and I was sitting in a pretty much an empty office. It's really quiet here. And, reading all psychology, the journal comes on my, hard copy, and this study was done on psychosocial development at the University of Rochester by a woman named Anne Constantinople, and she looked at college students and compared their psychosocial development. And I'm like, that's it. I'm just going to find those participants, and I'm going to test them again, and it's all going to be beautiful. We can actually get something going here with a longitudinal study. Well, it didn't work out quite that way, and I'll explain some of those gory details. But there I was in lowly old Rochester. I would say cold and snowy, but that that's no difference from here. Maybe a little colder and snowier. But the school was the University of Rochester, which is a private liberal arts university. It has a medical school. It has a music school that's very famous. And they had started a program in human development, and they hired me to be sort of the aging person there. And so that's where all this got started. So what happened then was, and I couldn't figure out what order to put this in, but I think I'm going to show some of the numbers, and I'm going to go into the history of the study. But I think it's helpful just to, yeah, I will. I'll do it this way. It was begun with one cohort. We did 4 follow-ups, and the last one just a few years ago. So, and I'll show you the design in a second. But every time a follow-up was done, new undergraduates were added. So it's a longitudinal study, but it's really technically a sequential study because there was more than one replication of the longitudinal study. There was a sequence of longitudinal studies. The design also permitted some other cool stuff to be done. But what had happened was when I, eventually got a hold of the data through long string of coincidences involving networking at a convention. I get the data on cards. I'm telling you a bunch, actual computer cards, and decided, well, the proper way to do research in 1977 is to get a new cohort. So we added a cohort of current undergraduates, and that was then the sequential piece that just kept going throughout the remainder of the study up to the last time. So this helps to kind of give you a sense of what the size was. And it, I counted those computer cards a million times, and every time I pretty much came up with a different number. But eventually, we settled on 348. There was some weird things in here, but approximately 348. And then in 1977, a little, about half of them were available, not quite. And then that's when we added that second cohort of undergraduates at the same institution. I was still teaching there, so it wasn't too hard to get that done. By 1989, I'd moved away to Amherst, but she persisted. And I had this group, and these were all people who had been previously tested up through here. We didn't really acquire anybody new. We had only 83 of this group, which is a very bad story, but I'll tell you in a minute. And then the new cohort got added. So now we're up to that. Then in 2002 was the last time we got a new cohort of undergraduates. And, that's a nice healthy number. The numbers actually improved for reasons I'll tell you about in a minute. And then this latest follow-up, those are the current numbers. They were roughly equal male and female, which is unusual in psychology. Usually it's like 60% female, 70% female, but this was equally divided. And then these were the people who actually did persist. And so we have the same data on 62, 41, 63, and 101, of course, because of the more recent. And then the percentages have been bobbing around there. I mean, cohort 2 obviously showed the worst decline. Every time we've done analyses from the study, though, we've gone back and compared the dropouts to follow-ups at all the previous times, which was a pain, but reviewers wanted that. They wanted to know that the survivors weren't different from the people who dropped out. And by and large, they weren't, which is kind of surprising. Now it might be different with the latest testing of the oldest cohort, but up until this last time, there were no differences. Now, I don't know, do people usually ask questions during?
It's up to you. Usually it's
Afterwards? Okay.
clarification questions during in one.
Unless there's something really blatantly wrong or confusing. But this should give you an idea of what the magnitude that we're talking about. And many different ways to slice it, but this was the simplest. But now I want to talk a little bit about the history of the study. And the reason that's important goes back to Erickson. we're not talking about people developing in a vacuum, especially during the college years. So you have here the two polarities of life at the University of Rochester in the 1960s. The super conservative people, of course, that was, Eastman Kodak was in Rochester, so, optics have always been big, and engineering at the U of R. And then there they were protesting at, I think that was down the street from the president's house, so they started pretty much in 1964, 65 with protests. They were definitely on the vanguard of student protests along with Berkeley. So that just gives you a little background on what this place was actually like as a college experience. And the thing about Rochester that makes it, unfortunately, a bit more specific than I would love to see it in terms of a representative sample, is that it was expensive to go there. I grew up in Buffalo. I tried to go there, and we couldn't afford it, so I went to the University of Buffalo. Then it was ironic when I actually taught there. That was nice. It was a pretty much upper middle class. Does anybody know anybody who went there?
She went there.
Oh! So you might have been in my school.
I went there for my master's for to the water school.
Oh, okay. Yeah, right. That's the street. Where I taught in Lattimore. Anyway, so so it's an interesting place for an undergraduate. It's very small. I write 4,000 undergraduates, and a lot of the people who were undergraduates there had wanted to go to some of the schools around here, but they didn't get in, and that was their second tier choice. Even though it was a perfectly good school until lately, when the newspaper go on. Because there's a social psych professor. There have been more protests. I actually found this on their website. Current protests, but my sample was already graduated. Because one of the professors in social, they wanted to fire him. There's a dispute about this because he was behaving badly, very badly. And I think the president just stepped down, I think, last week or 2 weeks ago. Yeah. So it's it's thought of as a kind of off the beaten track, a bit more conservative, and appeals to a certain kind of student, and then of course those are the students I had. So it's limited in the sense of a lot of students went on to be doctors and lawyers, and because that's what they were going there for. Pre-med was heavy there, and pre-law as well. Okay, so 1955, Anne Constantinople did the cross-sectional studies of the different classes, and then she followed them up over the course of their time there. So she actually did her own little mini longitudinal study of psychosocial development in college students just in those classes. And she got them through psych classes primarily. So by the time I got those lovely little cards, all we had on there was their ID number, their student ID number, 5 digits, and 12 numbers. That was it. So all they did was the inventory of psychosocial development, which was Constantinople's measure. It had 10 items per stage, only the first 6 of Erickson's 8 stages. I don't know what else she gave them, but that's all we had. So that's all we had. And so at that time, to get the participants, I had to, I'll tell you about that in 1975. So here's me coming along. And I had those cards, and I said, all right, well, let's try to find these people. So the alumni office was very wonderful to me all along. It's been terrific. And they gave me their names and all the current addresses they had of them. There were no email addresses back then, but just, hardcore old addresses. We sent out hardcore paper and pencil questionnaires, and I did expand, as you'll see. And we wrote to them. This time I consent forms because I didn't know if they had any before, but they were sure going to have them now to go through the IRB. And then we got cohort 2, that second little plug there in the diagonal. And so we went the usual classes, but then we'd sit outside in the quad on a nice day, I still remember the one where we were offering people lemonade and cookies for completing the questionnaire. Just sit there, out in the quad and fill out these questionnaires, and then we'd give them back to me. Or then we'd go in the campus center if the weather was bad. And eventually we scrambled together a pretty decent size of cohort 2. So we expanded the IPD, that Arizonian measure, to include the 2 latter stages. At the time, something called identity statuses was starting to interest people in this area, which is where you say somebody doesn't just have an identity or not, but is your identity one that's arrived at through exploration and evaluating alternatives for good life? Really thinking about what life means to you, or is it you just do what your parents wanted you to do or what they did? Do you not care? Identity diffuse, or are you just constantly in an uproar and not really ready to make a decision and maybe never make a decision? So those are the 4 categories of this interview, which we turned into a questionnaire measure for that study. The BEM sexual inventory, which was a measure of masculinity, femininity, androgyny, and then none of the above. So that was very popular at the time. Work and family from cohort 1. So this was just a simple list all the jobs you had, all your education, all your major family events. Just people would write in their handwriting, it's very quaint. And we'd get these pieces of paper, and then we coded them in terms of number of jobs and types of jobs and family events. But things were pretty simple because they were only in their 30s. And then this cohort 2 had to fill out a demographic questionnaire so we'd know what their parents' social class was. And by the 70s, one thing we see, so that's a kind of hanging out group of 70-ish people, the population at U of R did start to become more diverse over the decades, thankfully. And so there's not much diversity in the picture, but at least they weren't just sitting around in a chem lab or whatever taking pictures, and being all just men. So women were, actively involved in their own career paths, which was not true for the group in the 60s so much. But we did ask about their family background, and then we said, okay, there's room on this page. Let's say, what do you think you'll be doing 10 years from now in terms of your work and in terms of your family? So we threw in 2 little questions there at the end. I'm sure more thought went into it than that, but like, what's your shoe size? Didn't ask that. But, I was like, oh, that'd be cool. Let's ask them that just to see what they're saying about themselves. But then that was the last follow-up. So that was, okay, done it. I'll show you some results from that study. We proved the point. Next. And then I go to Penn State to visit my friend Sherry Willis, Warner Shia, and we're walking out. There was some kind of workshop there, or a little meeting, and we're walking around the woods behind their house at Penn State. And Sherry says to me, well, Sue, when are you going to do your next follow-up? I can't do her southern accent, but yeah, you get it. And I said, I was kind of done, and I moved. I was already at UMass, Amherst, and I had to pack up my stuff and leave. And why would I need these paper questionnaires? I have them on a computer tape. So, only one slight problem with that. The computer tape was unreadable. Yeah. So, dumb idea. That was just one of those decisions you see yourself doing it and deciding wrongly. I could have packed that box, or not packed that box, and it mainly affected cohort 2. We were in really bad shape with cohort 2. As you can see from those numbers, if you remember back, that was the lowest. So nevertheless, we went back to the alumni office. We tried everything we could think of at the time to figure out how to track those people down. In some cases, we didn't even have their names in it, really. But, it was an unplanned study. So the moral of the story is never throw out any of your data, which is easier now than it used to be, but don't put it on a floppy disk. It does make you worry. So cohort 3, I wasn't there anymore, so I got some of my colleagues who were there to go and do the same thing, go to the class, stand there, offer extra credit, and then we didn't have lemonade and cookies. We gave them money for some pizza down the street, the Elmwood Grill, and then that was their reward. So it's sort of food-ish. We were keeping with that theme. And then we gave the full IPD, we expanded on the identity status. This was a measure that one of my colleagues at Amherst, UMass Amherst, wanted to give. Unfortunately, he was funding the study and he had to give it, but I had very little interest in the beta thing anyway, so that never really got anything done with it. But we did ask about their work and family, and we did, again, for cohort 3. I'm like, wow, that was interesting last time. Let's test it again. So we did the exact same questionnaires to cohort 3 as cohort 2 had gotten when they were in college. So, and then we did not throw anything out. So when I moved here from Amherst, the same decision. But, it's sitting there in my basement now, nice and safe, along with the computer cards. So let's just hope it doesn't get flooded. No, but I have everything backed up in a million different ways. All right, so then 2002, we, go back, dip into the well one more time. And I had an undergraduate at UMass Amherst. She was from Rochester. So she came in to see me one day to find out being about an RA. I'm like, oh, nice to talk to you. Where are you from? She says, Rochester. I'm like, oh. Oh. So we planned for her to go back and visit during her spring break. And that's her heart. I talk about undergraduate RAs. I've talked to Jeff and Nina about how amazing they are. And so this undergraduate RA went and got all 300 or however many 291 participants herself by standing there recruiting people. That was that. I think we offered them a lottery. I can't remember exactly. It's in consent form somewhere, but it wasn't food, unfortunately. So the alumni office, again, very generously gave us data, names and contact information, emails, which is exciting. And then I discovered Find a Friend. One of my doctoral students used his dissertation grant to pay for Find a Friend, which is where you have somebody's social security number, which we did have. Now they switched from ID numbers to social security numbers. They probably switched back again. But anyway, we had those. We were able to go in and get names of people, and they weren't always correct, but it worked somewhat. And then 2 years after that, in 2002, I just set my mind to spending the summer in the basement of Tobin Hall, like this concrete bunker site building, and I'm going to find everybody that we couldn't find 2 years ago. And I just dug in on heels, and I started digging and digging and digging. And Alta Vista was there, and there was other things. And we actually unearthed a lot of people. And some interesting things about those people, too, like online chats and chat. I mean, people just put all this stuff out there. And if you don't even have to go into the dark web to find it. But I did find a lot more people. That's why the numbers go up when they should have gone down, because more people were unearthed. Anyway, same measures there. This time, though, we added the RIF Subjective Wellbeing Scale, which is a 54-item measure. It's commonly used now. Life Satisfaction, a simple 3-item measure. The McAdams Loyola Generativity Scale, and then the usual work and family post-confidence. And then, ta-da! And you can see these people changing, by the way. So you already see, there's a tiny bit of diversity. Now, this was on their recruiting side. You can tell they're actively recruiting a more diverse student population. But there was more diversity in our sample, and especially, now these are current alums. So, but now we really got into Google and the alumni office. I was embarrassed to go back to them yet again, but again, they were so nice to me, and they gave me more names, and I had spreadsheets with everybody's information. And then we started creating a database because the spreadsheets were getting out of control. Every step that was taken to find somebody was documented. Every email, every contact. So it now has become an official database with actual useful information in it if you're interested in recruitment. Then the measures were the same, except health conditions and behaviors got added, because for some reason they hadn't been asked for before. Oh, this time we asked about grandchildren. I don't know how I missed that before. And then we added a meaning and life questionnaire, measure on work burnout and work engagement, because some of the collaborators were interested in those specific areas. So that's what that all looked like at the last follow-up. So, it was a pretty intensive process. And what was really intense, of course, was dealing with the database and making sure everything is documented, because at the time, I wasn't really thinking about leaving or retire or anything like that, but I thought, well, I just want to make everything more documented, because that is a really important part of longitudinal work, potential work, is documentation of everything you do. And it becomes data in and of itself. And I wanted to do a paper at GSA, I don't think I ever did, called On Being an Online Detective. I think I got as far as the title, because it's such a cool title. It's going to sound kind of stalky and creepy. But it was going to be, you want to find your people. I've got ways to do it, and they're not illegal, mostly. So the slight unethical aspect to me, or worrisome part, was when did they sign a consent form and what did they know? Did they know I was going to be unearthing all their Facebook postings? But they didn't think they're private. Well, technically, there was no Facebook, but they did consent to being in future follow-ups. So, the IRB approved it. So and they were not an easy. They were not pushovers. Believe me, it took me a long time to get to IRB. And we've been very worried about the protection of participants, because we do have them identified by name. And I haven't met most of them, except two people. One who's a psychologist, so I met him, and he's writing me. It's really weird. He asked me for an endorsement for a committee in APA. And then somebody else was dying to see me. He was driving through Amherst, and he was coming from upstate New York. And I really don't want to see him because it's just weird. But then he'd been in the study every single time, and I felt sorry for him. Like he was obviously smelled a lot to him. So he came and see me. And it was interesting. He gave me some insights into the U of R at the time, and would have been like for him. But then he started asking me what his scores meant, and then he wanted to know if one of his friends could come along. And no. So it's usually better not to interact with people at all or 100%. But it was instructive to me, and he seemed happy by what I told him, even though it wasn't all good. But that was another issue. But it was kind of nice to hear from somebody who'd been there and was a participant. It did give it a little bit more of a human face. All right, so now I'm going to go through some of the results, and it's kind of builds with the methods as well as the available data. So this is back to the first study. So this was our brilliant insights into doing the time lag. So this time we split them up by gender because there was a huge time lag of interaction. But in general, for the longitudinal part, everybody's scores went up, from a low down there to higher up there. In the cross-sectional, just looking at the college students, the alumni here, college students, here you get a big difference for the males compared to the females. And then the time lag was a really interesting one to me, because this is where you have, college students. All right, what were they like in the 60s? What were they like in the 70s? And we knew that the 70s were a lot different than the 60s for reasons I've already documented. But in addition, just kind of the generation at the time. So the big thing here was and this, some of this is going to come back later, but for men, college students in 1976 were a lot lower on overall IPD scores. So it's the sex interaction so what was going on with these male college students in the 70s? I mean, the men were already lower in the 60s, and a little bit higher. But in the 70s, they get to be really low, and the females get to be really high. All college student data. So this is like 300 people. So that was interesting. We published it and said, see, you can't just look at one cohort. That's the bottom line from that study was if you look at just one cohort, it's going to be misleading. And so you have to keep replicating over time. But then in 1989, we had much more interesting data, which was looking at the longitudinal scores, and now this is the different scores, and this is just stage 4. Stage 4 is industry versus inferiority, so it's a sense of, buckling down and getting to work is basically how that one translates. So in the cohort 1 was pretty low, and then they shot up by 31. And then by 42, they started to, even out a little bit. Okay, so that's cohort 1. But look at cohort 2. Also, they go up. And, the measures here were not that sophisticated because we didn't have the equipment to do it. But that difference there now looks it was insignificant in the 1977 follow-up. The interaction with stage 4 didn't pan out, so I wasn't able to present that separately. But now there was better separation in the 1989 testing, and so something was going on with the college students in the 60s. They just weren't working that hard. Now they worked hard to get in there. Their parents certainly paid through the nose, but once they were there, they were either doing one of 3 things. They were either partying, they were either protesting, and sort of equally divided between that, or 3, they were just, discovering drugs and, alcohol, and just, that's part of partying, but maybe the drug scene became a little bit more prevalent, and they were just, on top all the time, and they were just pretty good, not really that engaged. So then in the 70s, people are more of an industrious generation. In the 70s, I had a picture of a disco I was going to put in there, just the opposite. But no, I felt that, and I was there at the time, and I knew these were hardworking students, and they were very focused on their careers. So I think they kind of got the message from their previous cohorts, or maybe older brothers and sisters, that it was time to buckle down. And then the other thing that happened, and then you can see yet a third cohort still higher than them. So it wasn't just a fluke about the 70s. And that's the beauty of getting these different data points from people who are the same age. And then, of course, they haven't been followed yet over time. So I think that takes care of the 1989 testing. Most of this was done with, ANOVAs. So, what psychologists make their bread and butter on. And the difficulty there, the interesting thing here methodologically was how do you count time 1, time 2, and time 3 when they mean different things for different cohorts. So Mike Zuschlag, who now works for the Volpe Transportation Department, he's an engineering psychologist, anyway, he was brilliant, and he said, all right, well, we'll have 2 different data sets, and they're going to be parallel depending on last time or year of testing. So that became an important way to identify the data that I still continue to use. All right. Another study from there, which took a while, 1997. It took a while to get this one out because all that coding of their biographical data was really hard. But we did find that identity versus diffusion, so that's the, sense of self. And this is just women. So their identity scores in college predicted their age 31 identity, and for some weird reason negatively related to SES. But it could be because the lower identity women married upper SES men. And I know that happens a lot in cohort 1. But then their age 31 identity scores actually then ended up also affecting their age 42, but also their SES at age 42. And so, but in a positive direction. So now the hunkering down women in college with the identity in college are now, the results are paying off in terms of their SES at age 42. So the reason this took so long to get out the door was this coding became very difficult, and the modeling at the time, you couldn't even do modeling, almost impossible. But we got that one out the door. So that was that. Now, the other thing that Mike Zuschlag did was look at the separate scores for the different college classes. So that was just the cohorts 2 and 3. So we were kind of curious to know what happens over the college years with these people if you collapse the two cohorts. And this one I did put a little arrow in there. So now we can say it's the sophomores whose industry scores are really low. So it's not just everybody with low industry scores, it's sophomores, which relates to the familiarly called what? Sophomores. Sophomore slump. So we have evidence that sophomore slump really, it was strange. It really picked out industry. And now this was 2 different cohorts, so you could say, well, cohort 1 was out of the picture. So those slackers in cohort 1 aren't even in here. We're now looking at regular old college students from the later cohorts. So that was kind of interesting to be able to pinpoint the findings like that. Now, in 2002, the world invented growth modeling. But the world didn't make it easy to growth model. So this was very agonizing, but we were able to take this was a study I did with Aileen Sayer, who's at UMass Amherst. She's kind of the HLM guru there. She developed the software, thank goodness, because nobody else could figure it out. And she collaborated on this. But what we did was try to track growth curves now, which is a much more sophisticated way of looking at development than dots. And so these average out the curves for our favorite little quality of industry. So there's cohort 1 and cohort 2. And what you see are cohort differences in the curves. But you also see this little pattern of people with low scores kind of catching up in their prestige, and very much the case in cohort 1. So the low prestige have lower scores than the high prestige by a hair in that cohort 1. But everybody goes up and they become undifferentiated from each other. And cohort 2 stops there. Now we're going to be looking at to see what they've done now that they're older. But you see this sort of catching up thing, and you really saw it with intimacy, that the people who were in no relationship in the oldest cohort now they were, that little line up there, cohort relationship, 1946, cohort 1, no relationship. They show a slightly different bend in the middle around age 30, but they all catch up by the time they're in their 50s. But then cohort 2, the younger cohort, showed like the opposite pattern. So even if you make nothing of the data in terms of substance, which you can make something of the data, but just pretending we're not even interested in that, the fact alone that there are these different models says you can't just look at one cohort. Again, you have to keep looking at things from separating out by the context of the people at the time that they're in the study. So that was a long, complicated one, but we were doing modeling with, we started to use the well-being scores and relating that to the psychosocial development, and that became sort of an interesting exercise because, again, you could do this sort of cross-lag thing, and here are the only paths for intimacy at age 31 to identity at age 42, and then identity goes back to identity and affects well-being. But even intimacy at age 20 affects well-being at age 54 a little bit. So, there's something powerful going on with the college years. Okay, these results are hideous to look at until I'm getting towards the end because these numbers are getting teenier and teenier. But so what happened this last year was, deciding to move. I had this colleague, Jennifer Louie-Smith, who is a social psychologist, personality psychologist, who is now at Canisius College in Buffalo, New York. So upstate, she's back upstate. And she and I were collaborating on some things. And I said, wow, I have this data set, it's really big, it's really complex, and there's all this stuff in there, and blah, blah, blah. and this is the kind of thing she lives and breathes and sleeps all, on is secondary data sets. She had worked on some pretty big health and behavior personality studies back when she was a postdoc with Denise Parks. So we got to talking. So I don't even want to talk about anything on this graph other than this is in process. And so what she's doing now is modeling, the actual growth curves. And something weird is happening with some of these numbers. These are very big numbers to have, like that's a crazy number. We don't really know what's going on, but that's in progress. And the nice thing is we are able to use R, and she is able to use R. And what I've given her is a really pretty nicely packaged data set that she can convert from SPSS to R. But there are opportunities in this study. Don't feel left out, because I'm going to tell you about what's going on now. So a couple of years ago, we just looked at the meaning of life scale, just for fun, and we found that search for meaning, this is cross-sectional, I do apologize, but across all these are the different age groups, is lower in people 16 and older, and the presence of meaning sort of nudges up. What do you not see in this figure that you might expect to see if you were, let's say, a midlife crisis person, a journalist wanting to prove there's a midlife crisis? Would this make you feel good or bad?
Search for meaning.
Yeah, but is there, wait a minute, where's the midlife crisis? Oh, there isn't one. So this graph took me 2 hours to explain to somebody one day. They were doing a Wall Street Journal on midlife crisis yet again. And I said, oh, well, I have the data for my APA paper. I'm sorry, that got cut off. So I tried to explain to her, look, no, none. There ain't one. And people become, no, I never have found everybody showed one path. In fact, if you see anything from this graph besides hideousness, is that there is not one path. And that's what Jen said to me. She said, look, to interpret this, it just says people are changing at different rates. And I've known this all along. Some people go up, some people go down, some people stay the same. Why? And that's basically the question. So then you try to relate their life events to it, and you try to pick it apart. But that's showing that this is just a straight shot at meaning in life. But yeah, not everybody was great on meaning in life when they were 60. There were some who deviated, and the error bars are there. And I know from just looking at the patterns of their lives that there was a tremendous amount of variation in that. One of the qualitative studies I did was the pathways through life. Search for Fulfillment was this popular book I did, where we just did the qualitative narratives constructed out of the bare bones of the data we had on people's lives and their scores. So now here's a really cool, most recent study. This was my favorite one. And it was done with an undergraduate RA. She and I were looking at their college plans versus their actual career. Remember that? That really random question thrown at the end. So if you you can rate people's occupations in a bunch of different ways, but we used what's called the RIASEC model, which is now used by the Department, by Bureau of Labor Statistics and they're using the classification of occupations is now based on the RIASEC model. So those are the different kinds of interests people have. And then someone else divided these into a much easier quadrant. And what you can do with this, and what Sam and I did, was we rated every single one of their occupations with the census code, and then we transferred that to a RIASEC code. Then you transfer the RIASEC to this easier one to use, the data, ideas, people, things, and you plot where somebody is now, and you plot where somebody said they want it to be, and you get that difference, which is called the Euclidean distance, I guess. It's like an algebraic term. You calculate the formula. It's when you have this kind of graph. So then we looked at Euclidean distances and their identity scores. So this was just their identity scores in college, and of course the seniors were higher. But these were the Euclidean distances. So a high distance is bad. And so the first year students had higher Euclidean distances, meaning they were further apart. But then the real money was in this one, which is their Euclidean group. So low Euclidean distance, meaning concordance, had higher identity scores back in college. Now, it's true that the seniors had higher scores than everybody else, but this wasn't an artifact of college class. So this is saying the people with more robust identities in colleges had a better sense of their careers. Anyway, future directions. So that's a little tantalizing bit. Anybody wants to nibble off that candy, more than welcome to. But we want to do more growth modeling to get some of those numbers a little better. Get the database all curated. Working more on the occupational coding, which is sitting there ready to be plucked out. Retirement, whoa, these people have started retiring, and we know what they were like in college. Many of them, certainly by age 31. We've asked about health. One can do some of these future lag studies of generativity and subjective well-being, like you saw some of that, and then more long-term outcomes, college data, etc. So there's tons left to do. So Jen and I are, she's applying for support for secondary data analysis. And she promises to come and get that box of computer cards from my basement. And all the other stuff that I haven't thrown out ever since 1989. You know, we're going to continue to delve through this, but I really would be excited about the possibility of people working with me. We do have time for questions, right?
Yes, we do. We have 15 minutes.
Oh, good, good, good. Okay, I got nervous.
No, I'm just.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there's ample opportunities, and Jen is, you know, with the Open Science Initiative, we have to be careful because we have to protect the participants. Their identities are really linked to their scores, but there's still ways that you can become vetted and trained to be able to use, as many people do, not just me, longitudinal data sets. So that's kind of the wave of the future. She promises me there's going to be another follow-up, and she lives in Buffalo, so maybe she'll trek down the highway and get that next wave of college students. But even if she doesn't, we're going to have plenty to work on for the coming years, and we will be doing another follow-up just of the existing cohorts.
Okay, thank you.